May 25, 1977. Harrison Ford McKenna walked into conference room C at 20th Century Fox carrying a script marked with red ink and 47 years of Hollywood experience. He had one job: fix the dialogue that everyone knew was broken. George Lucas sat at the head of the table. The producer who would destroy Harrison's life sat 3 chairs down. Harrison opened the script to page 43 and said 5 words that would end everything. "This dialogue is absolute garbage." The room went silent. Security cameras rolled. Someone was recording every word. What happened in the next 12 minutes became Hollywood's most buried secret. 3 people in that room would never work again. One would be dead within a week. And for 45 years, when industry insiders whispered about the real story behind Star Wars, they always came back to this meeting. The meeting where Harrison Ford McKenna told the truth. The meeting that proves some secrets are worth killing for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room's fluorescent lights hummed like angry wasps as Harrison Ford McKenna watched the producer's face turn the color of old parchment. Alan Hirsch, the man whose name appeared on half the blockbusters of the decade, slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses and placed them on the mahogany table with surgical precision. "Garbage," Hirsch repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You called George's dialogue garbage." Harrison didn't flinch. At 59, he'd survived 3 studio regime changes, the collapse of the old contract system, and a marriage that died somewhere between his rewrite of The Godfather and his uncredited Polish on Chinatown. He knew when a room turned hostile. "I called it what it is," Harrison said, tapping the script with his Mont Blanc pen. "Princess Leia sounds like she's reading a grocery list. Han Solo talks like a cowboy who learned English from a manual. And Luke," he flipped through several pages, "Luke sounds like he's auditioning for a toothpaste commercial." George Lucas shifted uncomfortably at the head of the table. The young director's flannel shirt was wrinkled, his beard unkempt. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in weeks. The film was already over budget, behind schedule, and the studio executives were circling like vultures. "Harrison," George said quietly, "I know it needs work. That's why you're here. But maybe we could approach this more diplomatically?" Harrison cut him off. "George, in 6 weeks this thing hits theaters. You want diplomatic, or do you want it to work?" The third man in the room hadn't spoken since introductions. Marcus Kellerman sat in the corner, supposedly there to represent the studio's interests. But Harrison had noticed something odd. Kellerman wasn't taking notes. Instead, he was watching, studying. His pale eyes moved between Harrison and Hirsch, like he was watching a tennis match where he already knew the score. Harrison opened to a random page and began reading aloud. "I have placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the memory systems of this R2 unit. My father will know how to retrieve it. You must see this droid safely delivered to him on Alderaan." He looked up. "Does anyone here actually believe a 19-year-old princess talks like a NASA manual?" Hirsch's jaw tightened. "Those lines test well with focus groups." "Focus groups." Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're making a space adventure, Alan, not a doctoral thesis. Kids don't want to hear characters recite technical specifications. They want to feel something. And what would you suggest?" Kellerman spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Harrison felt something shift in the room. The question wasn't about dialogue anymore. There was an undercurrent he couldn't identify, a tension that had nothing to do with script problems. "I'd suggest we remember we're telling a story about people, not machines," Harrison said carefully. "Even in space." Kellerman smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Interesting. And you think your perspective is more valuable than the combined wisdom of the studio system that's been making hits for 50 years? The challenge was unmistakable. Harrison had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize a power play when he saw one. But something else nagged at him. Why was Kellerman really here? Studio representatives didn't usually attend script meetings. They sent underlings to take notes and report back. "I think," Harrison said slowly, "that my job is to make this script work. Nothing more, nothing less. Your job, Hirsch said, standing up, is whatever we say it is. And right now, I'm questioning whether you're the right man for it. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Harrison had seen careers destroyed over less. Writers who pushed too hard, who forgot that in Hollywood, being right was often less important than being agreeable. But as he looked around the table, something crystallized in his mind. George needed this film to work. The young director's entire career hung in the balance. And if the dialogue stayed as wooden as a puppet show, no amount of special effects would save it. Harrison closed the script and met Hirsch's stare. Then I guess we have a problem. In the corner, Kellerman's smile widened. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device Harrison didn't recognize, something that looked like a cross between a calculator and a radio. He set it on the table and pressed a button. The fluorescent lights flickered. "Gentlemen," Kellerman said softly, "I think it's time we discussed what this meeting is really about." Harrison felt his blood turn to ice water. Whatever was happening, it had nothing to do with Star Wars dialogue, and everything to do with something far more dangerous. The device on the table emitted a soft electronic whine that made Harrison's molars ache. He'd never seen anything like it. In 1977, most people still used rotary phones and considered digital watches the height of technology. Whatever Kellerman had just activated looked like it belonged in a science fiction film, not a studio conference room. "Recording equipment," Kellerman said, noting Harrison's stare. "State of the art. The kind that picks up conversations through walls or captures voices even when people think they're speaking privately." Harrison's mouth went dry. He thought of the phone call he'd made to his daughter Sarah that morning, telling her about this meeting, about how it might be the break that could finally get him back on top. She was 24 now, struggling to make her own way in the industry as an assistant director, and he'd wanted to give her hope that the McKenna name might mean something again. What does this have to do with Star Wars? George's voice cracked slightly. The young director was already drowning in studio pressure. This mysterious technological intimidation was clearly beyond his comprehension. Kellerman ignored George entirely. His pale eyes remained fixed on Harrison. "3 nights ago, Mr. McKenna, you had dinner at Musso and Frank's with a young actress named Diana Volkov. Do you remember what you discussed?" The blood drained from Harrison's face. Diana was barely 22, a stunning brunette with intelligent eyes who'd been cast in a small role in a thriller he'd been brought in to doctor 6 months ago. She'd approached him at the restaurant, sliding into the booth across from him with the nervous energy of someone carrying a dangerous secret. "I remember having dinner," Harrison said carefully. "I don't remember discussing anything that would interest the studio." "She told you about Marcus Kellerman," Kellerman said, and something in his tone made Harrison's skin crawl. The man was speaking about himself in third person, as if he were discussing a character in a script. "She told you things she'd overheard, things about how certain decisions get made in this town, about which projects get greenlit and which ones disappear, about which actors get parts and which ones don't." Harrison's hands were trembling now. Diana had indeed told him things, terrible things about a network of powerful men who controlled more than just movie deals. She'd worked as a hostess at private parties in the hills above Sunset Strip, parties where studio heads and producers made arrangements that had nothing to do with artistic merit. She'd been scared, talking about wanting to go to the authorities about having evidence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison lied. Kellerman reached into his jacket again and withdrew a manila envelope. From it, he produced a photograph, black and white, grainy, but unmistakably showing Harrison and Diana in the restaurant booth, their heads close together in intimate conversation. "The problem with being a script doctor, Mr. McKenna, is that you develop an ear for dialogue. You can tell when someone's being honest. You can spot the lies, the inconsistencies, the places where the story doesn't quite work." Kellerman's smile was reptilian. Diana Volkov had the same talent. She could see the holes in our story. Our story? Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. "The story we tell the world about how Hollywood works, about merit and talent and artistic vision." Kellerman gestured around the room, encompassing not just the conference table, but the entire industry beyond these walls. "It's a beautiful story, very inspiring. The problem is, like most Hollywood stories, It's almost entirely fictional. George was staring between them like a man watching a foreign film without subtitles. I don't understand what's happening here. What's happening, Hirsch said, speaking for the first time since Kellerman had activated his device, is that Mr. McKenna is learning about consequences, about what happens when writers forget their place in the food chain. Harrison thought of Sarah, probably sitting in some cramped production office right now, believing that hard work and talent would be enough to build a career. He thought of Diana Volkoff, young and frightened and trusting enough to think that telling the truth to someone like him could make a difference. He thought of his ex-wife, Margaret, who'd left him because she said Hollywood had poisoned his soul, that he'd become someone she didn't recognize. What do you want? He asked. Kellerman carefully returned the photograph to its envelope. We want you to understand that some stories are too dangerous to tell, Mr. McKenna, and some dialogue is too honest for its own good. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the conference table. Harrison realized that nothing would ever be the same after this moment, not for him, not for the frightened young director beside him, and certainly not for the idealistic daughter he'd raised to believe that truth mattered more than power. Outside the conference room windows, the California sun was setting over the studio lot, painting the sky the color of blood. The silence in the conference room stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the electronic whine of Kellerman's device. Harrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. He was calculating distances, how far to the door, whether George would follow, what his chances were of getting out of the building before Kellerman's people could stop him. Then the device on the table began to ring. It wasn't the familiar jangle of a telephone. This was something else entirely. A series of electronic pulses that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly into his skull. Kellerman frowned and pressed a series of buttons on the device's face. Kellerman, he said, into what Harrison now realized was some kind of advanced communication system. A voice emerged from the device. Tinny but clear. We have a problem. The Volkoff situation has escalated. Harrison's blood turned to ice. Diana. They were talking about Diana. Kellerman's pale eyes fixed on Harrison as he spoke. Define escalated. She made a recording, audio tape hidden in a safety deposit box. Her roommate found the key this morning, along with instructions to open it if anything happened to her. The bottom dropped out of Harrison's world. If Diana had recorded their conversation at Musso and Frank's, if she'd captured him talking about the corruption she'd witnessed, about the network of powerful men who traded roles for favors and silenced anyone who threatened their system. The recording mentions McKenna by name, the voice continued, discusses their meeting, references specific individuals and incidents. George was staring at Harrison now, his young face pale with dawning comprehension. Harrison, what is this about? What recording? But Harrison couldn't speak, because suddenly he understood why Kellerman was really here, why this meeting had nothing to do with Star Wars dialogue. They'd been watching him, watching Diana, probably watching everyone who might threaten their carefully constructed empire. Kellerman pressed another button, and the voice cut out. The electronic whine resumed, now sounding less like a mosquito and more like a death knell. Diana Volkoff died in a car accident 3 days ago, Kellerman said conversationally. Terrible tragedy. Brake failure on Mulholland Drive. These old cars, you know how unreliable they can be. Harrison's hands gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles went white. You killed her. I didn't kill anyone, Mr. McKenna. I'm just a studio representative. Kellerman's smile was the most terrifying thing Harrison had ever seen. But sometimes people make poor choices. Sometimes they forget that certain stories shouldn't be told. The room was spinning. Harrison thought of Diana's face across the table at Musso and Frank's, her dark eyes bright with fear and determination. She'd been trying to do the right thing, trying to expose a system that preyed on young women like herself. And now she was dead. The recording, Hirsch said quietly, does it implicate everyone she mentioned? Kellerman cut him off, including Mr. McKenna here. Of course, the contents of the recording will depend entirely on how cooperative everyone decides to be going forward. It was a threat wrapped in silk, but Harrison heard it clearly. They had evidence that could destroy him, could make him an accessory to their crimes simply by virtue of his conversation with Diana. but they were offering him a choice: disappear quietly or be destroyed publicly. George stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know what this is about, but I don't want any part of it. I just want to make my movie." Kellerman's laugh was soft and deadly. "Oh, George, your movie is going to be the biggest success in Hollywood history. It's going to make everyone involved very, very rich. Don't you think that's worth a little discretion?" "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Mr. McKenna's services as a script doctor are no longer required. In fact, Mr. McKenna himself is no longer required. His consulting credit will be removed. His involvement in this project will be erased from all records. And if anyone asks, he was never here at all." Harrison felt something breaking inside his chest. Not just his career, that had been hanging by a thread already, but his sense of himself, his belief that somewhere in this rotten industry there was still room for honesty, for people who would do the right thing even when it cost them everything. Kellerman reached into his jacket one more time and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "Inside this envelope, Mr. McKenna, you'll find a contract. A very generous contract, actually. You'll be compensated handsomely for your silence. All you have to do is sign, leave this building, and never speak about what you've learned here today." "And if I don't?" Kellerman's pale eyes glittered. "Then, tomorrow morning, the police will receive an anonymous tip about Diana Volkoff's final conversation, about how she told a certain washed-up script doctor all about her plans to expose certain powerful individuals, about how that script doctor might have warned those individuals what she was planning. The trap was perfect, elegant, inescapable." Harrison looked at George, young and frightened and completely out of his depth. He thought of Sarah, trying to build a career in an industry that would destroy anyone who threatened its secrets. He thought of Diana Volkoff, who trusted him with the truth and died for it. Outside the conference room windows, the California sun had finished setting. Darkness was falling over Hollywood, and Harrison Ford McKenna realized that for him, it might never lift again. Harrison's hand hovered over the manila envelope like a man reaching toward a loaded gun. The contract inside represented everything he'd spent his career fighting against: the surrender of truth to power, the choice of safety over integrity. But Kellerman's trap was perfect: sign and disappear, or refuse and be framed for Diana's murder. "I need time to think," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kellerman's smile widened. "Of course, take all the time you need." He glanced at his watch. "You have until noon tomorrow. After that, certain parties will become impatient." Harrison stood on unsteady legs, the envelope clutched in his trembling hands. George was still frozen in his chair, staring at the scene like a man watching his own execution. The young director's dreams of cinematic glory had just collided with the brutal reality of how Hollywood actually functioned. "George," Harrison said quietly, "whatever happens, make the movie you want to make." But George wouldn't meet his eyes. Already, Harrison could see the calculations running behind the young man's glasses: career versus conscience, success versus solidarity. It was a math problem Harrison knew by heart, and there was only ever one answer that Hollywood accepted. The walk to his car felt like a funeral march. Every step across the studio lot was another moment of his old life dying. Security guards who'd nodded respectfully that morning now avoided his gaze. Word traveled fast in this town, and somehow everyone already knew that Harrison Ford McKenna was finished. His phone was ringing when he reached his apartment in Laurel Canyon. Sarah's voice on the answering machine was bright with excitement. "Dad, call me back. I heard you were at Fox today working on something big. Maybe we can finally celebrate some good news for once." Harrison stared at the machine, unable to pick up. How could he tell his daughter that her father was now a dead man walking, that her own career might be poisoned by association with his name? The Kellerman machine was efficient. They would make sure his toxicity spread to anyone foolish enough to maintain contact with him. He poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his reading chair, the contract still unopened on the coffee table. Outside, the hills of Hollywood glittered with the lights of dreams being born and destroyed in equal measure. Somewhere out there, other young actresses like Diana were discovering that their beauty and talent made them targets rather than treasures. The phone rang again at midnight. Harrison let it go to the machine, but the voice that emerged made his blood freeze. "Harrison, it's Tommy Chen." A long pause, filled with the sound of traffic and fear. "Look, man, I can't talk long, but you need to know they've been asking about you. About who you've talked to, who you trust. Jesus, Harrison, what did you step in?" The line went dead. Tommy Chen was a cinematographer who'd worked with Harrison on half a dozen projects over the years. If Kellerman's people were reaching out to Harrison's professional network, conducting interviews, building a file, at 2 a.m., Margaret called. "They came to see me tonight," his ex-wife said without preamble. "Two men in expensive suits asking about your mental state and whether I thought you were capable of violence. I told them to get the hell off my property, but Harrison, they knew things. About our marriage, about why we split up. Things I never told anyone." Harrison's mouth went dry. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly, but they made it clear that my cooperation would be remembered, and that my lack of cooperation would also be remembered." Her voice was shaking. "What kind of people are these, Harrison?" "The kind that own this town," he said. "Stay away from me, Margaret, for your own safety." "What about Sarah?" The question hung between them like a sword. Their daughter was the one pure thing they'd created together, the one person in this rotten industry who still believed in the possibility of honest storytelling. If Kellerman's reach extended to her, "I'll handle it," Harrison lied. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Not the decision Kellerman expected, but the only one Harrison could live with. He called his lawyer and his bank, making arrangements that would take effect whether he was alive or dead to implement them. He wrote letters to Sarah, to Margaret, to the few journalists he trusted who might someday want to investigate what had really happened to Diana Volkov. Then he drove back to Fox Studios, the unsigned contract in his passenger seat. The lot was quieter in the morning, but Harrison could feel eyes tracking his movement from windows and doorways. Kellerman's surveillance network was already in place, watching for any sign of rebellion. But Harrison Ford McKenna had spent 30 years in Hollywood learning how to read between the lines, and he'd finally found a story worth dying for. The conference room door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Harrison stepped through the doorway and found Kellerman waiting exactly where he'd left him, as if the man hadn't moved in the intervening hours. The electronic device still hummed on the conference table, and Hirsch sat in the same chair, though his expensive suit looked rumpled now, as if he'd slept in it. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes hung in the air like a funeral shroud. "Mr. McKenna," Kellerman said without looking up from the papers spread before him. "I trust you've had time to consider our offer." Harrison walked to the conference table and placed the unsigned contract on its surface. The pages made a soft whisper against the polished wood, the sound of a life being erased. "I want to know about Diana's recording," Harrison said. Kellerman's pale eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement. "Direct. I appreciate that in a writer. Most Hollywood people dance around the truth until it dies of exhaustion." "The recording," Harrison pressed. "What exactly did she capture?" "Everything." Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying Harrison like a specimen under glass. "Your dinner conversation was quite comprehensive, Mr. McKenna. Diana was a very thorough young woman. She captured your discussion of the parties, the arrangements, the network of favors and obligations that really run this industry. She also captured your promise to help her find journalists who might be interested in her story." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. He had promised Diana that, had given her hope that someone would listen, that the truth could actually matter in a town built on beautiful lies. Now that promise had become the instrument of his destruction. "More importantly," Kellerman continued, "she captured your emotional response when she told you about Marcus Kellerman's special projects. Your anger, your disgust, your very specific threats about what you'd like to see happen to certain individuals." Harrison's mouth went dry. He remembered that moment, the surge of rage when Diana had described what she'd witnessed, the powerful men who treated young actresses like party favors, the systematic abuse disguised as business as usual. He'd spoken without thinking, letting his fury spill out in words that could now be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. "But here's what's truly fascinating," Kellerman said, reaching into his jacket and withdrawing a small cassette tape. "Diana wasn't the only one recording that night." Harrison stared at the tape, his world tilting on its axis. What? We've been monitoring Miss Volkov for weeks, Mr. McKenna, ever since she started asking uncomfortable questions about certain private gatherings. We knew she was planning to approach someone. We just weren't sure who. When she chose you, we realized we had an opportunity to solve two problems simultaneously. The conference room seemed to shrink around Harrison. Everything, the dinner, Diana's revelations, even his own moral outrage, had been orchestrated. He'd been maneuvered into position like a piece on a chessboard, and he'd moved exactly as they'd expected. "You killed her to frame me," he whispered. "We solved a problem," Kellerman corrected. Diana Volkov was going to destroy careers, ruin lives, bring down an entire ecosystem that employs thousands of people, and you, Mr. McKenna, had become unreliable. Your conscience was making you unprofitable. Hirsch spoke for the first time since Harrison had entered the room. "The industry is bigger than any individual, Harrison. What we do here, the dreams we create, the stories we tell, that matters more than one girl's hurt feelings or one writer's moral qualms." Harrison looked around the conference room, seeing it clearly for the first time. This wasn't where business was conducted. This was where souls were purchased. The contracts and development deals were just the paperwork. The real transactions involved something far more valuable and infinitely harder to recover once lost. "Sarah called this morning," Kellerman said conversationally. "Apparently, she's been offered a development deal with Paramount. Very generous terms for such a young filmmaker. It would be a shame if that opportunity evaporated." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Harrison felt something fundamental break inside his chest, not his heart, which had been cracking for years, but his spine. The thing that had kept him upright through 3 decades of Hollywood compromise and small betrayals finally snapped. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Kellerman smiled, and Harrison realized he was looking into the face of something that had never been human at all. "Nothing," Kellerman said. "That's the beauty of it. You're going to do absolutely nothing. You're going to disappear, Mr. McKenna. And when you're gone, it will be as if Harrison Ford McKenna never existed at all." The electronic device on the table pulsed once, like a mechanical heartbeat, and Harrison understood that his old life had just flatlined. Harrison stared at Kellerman's inhuman smile, feeling the walls of his manufactured reality crumble around him. The electronic device pulsed again, its rhythm matching the hammering of his heart, and suddenly the sound triggered a memory that made his blood turn to ice. He'd heard that exact pulse before. Not here, not today, but 45 years ago, in his antiquarian bookshop in Mendocino. The encrypted email, the surveillance footage, the mysterious benefactor who'd known exactly where to find him after decades of carefully constructed invisibility. "The footage," Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Star Wars meeting footage that someone sent me last week. That was you." Kellerman's pale eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Very good, Mr. McKenna. Though it took you longer than I expected to make the connection." The revelation hit Harrison like a physical blow. Everything, the mysterious email, the never-before-seen footage of this very meeting, the promise of evidence that could restore his reputation, had been bait in an elaborate trap spanning nearly half a century. "You've been watching me," Harrison said, understanding flooding through him like poison. "All these years, in Mendocino. You knew where I was the whole time." "Of course we did." Kellerman leaned forward, and Harrison could see his own reflection in those cold eyes. A broken old man who'd never escaped his cage, only moved to a prettier cell. "Did you really think we'd let someone with your knowledge simply disappear? You were never hiding, Mr. McKenna. You were being preserved." Harrison's mind raced backward through 45 years of what he'd thought was freedom. The bookshop that had appeared on the market at exactly the right price when he'd needed to disappear. The customers who'd kept him barely afloat financially year after year. The occasional inquiries about rare manuscripts that had felt too convenient, too perfectly timed to his needs. "The book business," he said, his voice hollow. "The collectors who kept me in business. Our people, mostly. A small price to pay to keep tabs on a potentially dangerous asset." Kellerman's smile widened. "We couldn't risk you becoming desperate, you see. Desperate men do unpredictable things. Better to keep you comfortable, isolated, gradually convinced that your old life had been a fever dream. The conference room seemed to spin around Harrison. Every choice he'd made, every moment of what he'd thought was self-determination, had been carefully orchestrated by the same forces that had destroyed Diana Volkov. He'd been living in a prison designed to feel like paradise, and he'd been grateful for the privilege. "Why now?" Harrison managed to ask. "Why bring me back after all this time?" Kellerman reached into his jacket again and withdrew a photograph. Harrison's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Sarah's face, not as she was now, but as she'd been 3 days ago, sitting across a restaurant table from a man Harrison didn't recognize. "Your daughter has been asking questions," Kellerman said conversationally, "investigating old Hollywood scandals for a documentary she's developing, something about the dark side of the studio system in the 1970s. She's gotten remarkably close to certain uncomfortable truths." The photograph trembled in Harrison's hands. Sarah's face was animated, excited, the way she looked when she was onto a story that mattered. She had no idea she was walking into the same trap that had killed Diana Volkov 45 years earlier. "She found Diana's roommate," Kellerman continued. "The woman is in her 80s now, living in a nursing home in Pasadena. Very talkative when the right person asks the right questions. She mentioned Diana's final conversation with a script doctor named Harrison Ford McKenna." Harrison felt the last piece of his world collapse. All his years of silence, of self-imposed exile, of protecting Sarah by staying away from her life, none of it had mattered. His daughter had inherited his fatal flaw, the inability to leave well enough alone when injustice was staring her in the face. "So you lured me back," Harrison said, understanding flooding through him. The footage, the promise of vindication, it was all to get me in this room again. "To give you a choice," Kellerman corrected. "The same choice we offered 45 years ago with slightly different stakes. Sign the contract, disappear permanently this time, and Sarah's documentary never gets made. Refuse, and we'll be forced to help her understand exactly what happened to idealistic young women who dig too deep into matters that don't concern them." Harrison looked down at the unsigned contract, then back at Kellerman's merciless face. 45 years of believing he'd saved his daughter by sacrificing himself, and all he'd done was delay the inevitable confrontation. But this time, Harrison Ford McKenna was done being anyone's preserved asset. "You made one mistake," he said quietly. Kellerman's eyebrows rose. "Oh? You let me live long enough to stop being afraid." The silence that followed Harrison's declaration stretched like a taut wire. Kellerman's pale eyes studied him with the detached interest of a scientist observing an unexpected mutation in a familiar specimen. Hirsch shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking like old bones. "Afraid?" Kellerman finally said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "Mr. McKenna, you've been afraid for 45 years. Fear is what's kept you breathing all this time." Harrison stood slowly, his joints protesting after decades of carrying the weight of his silence. The movement felt different now, not the careful, measured actions of a man trying to remain invisible, but the deliberate steps of someone who had finally chosen his battlefield. "You're right," Harrison said, walking to the conference room window that overlooked the Fox lot. Below, the machinery of dream creation ground on. Writers hurrying between buildings with coffee-stained scripts, executives in golf carts discussing deals that would reshape careers, young hopefuls clutching headshots like prayer cards. I was afraid, terrified actually. "But you know what I've learned in my 72 years, Kellerman?" He turned back to face the two men who had orchestrated his life like puppet masters pulling strings. "Fear has an expiration date. Keep someone afraid long enough, and eventually they realize they've got nothing left to lose." Kellerman's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "You have your daughter to lose." "Do I?" Harrison's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "I've stayed away from Sarah for decades, convinced myself I was protecting her by maintaining my exile. But she found Diana's story anyway, didn't she? She inherited my stubborn streak, my inability to let sleeping dogs lie. You created exactly what you were trying to prevent." Harrison moved closer to the conference table, his shadow falling across the unsigned contract like a judgment. "The beautiful irony is that by keeping me alive, By preserving me in my little bookshop prison, you gave me something you never intended to give me. Which is? Hirsch spoke up, his voice tight with nervousness. Time to think. Harrison's eyes locked on Kellerman's. 45 years to replay every moment of that night with Diana, to understand exactly how this machine works, to realize that men like you only have power as long as people like me keep feeding it to you. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, but Harrison caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. You're posturing, McKenna, trying to convince yourself you have agency in a situation where you have none. Sign the contract, and Sarah lives to make other documentaries. Refuse, and she becomes another cautionary tale about young filmmakers who bite off more than they can chew. There's a third option. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small digital recorder. The device was ancient by modern standards, probably purchased at some electronics clearance sale years ago. But the red recording light glowed like an angry eye. Everything, Harrison said quietly. From the moment I walked in here today to this very conversation. Your threats against Sarah, your admission about Diana's murder, your description of the surveillance network you've used to monitor me for 4 decades. Hirsch shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward. You can't, that's illegal recording. In a private meeting on studio property? Harrison's smile was sharp as broken glass. I'm sure your legal department will craft some argument about consent and admissibility, but by then, copies will already be in the hands of every investigative journalist I can reach, starting with the team Sarah's been working with on her documentary. Kellerman hadn't moved, but his pale eyes had gone completely flat, the look of a predator calculating distance and angles of attack. Destroying yourself won't bring Diana back. No, Harrison agreed. But it might save the next Diana, and the one after that. He clicked off the recorder and slipped it back into his pocket. You see, that's what you never understood about writers, Kellerman. We tell stories, and the best stories, the ones that really matter, they're the ones someone doesn't want told. The electronic device on the conference table pulsed faster now, its rhythm agitated. Harrison realized it wasn't just surveillance equipment. It was probably a panic button, connected to security, to damage control, to all the mechanisms that kept Kellerman's empire functioning in the shadows. You think you're the first idealist to walk into this room with recording equipment and righteous indignation? Kellerman's voice was silk over steel. You think Diana was the first young woman to threaten this system? Mr. McKenna, you're not the hero of this story. You're just another character who's outlived his usefulness. Harrison walked to the door, each step feeling like a small victory against gravity and fear, and 45 years of carefully constructed cowardice. At the threshold, he turned back one final time. Maybe, he said. But this character just wrote himself a better ending. Harrison's hand was on the door handle when Kellerman's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. She's already dead. The words hit Harrison with the force of physical impact. He froze, his fingers gripping the metal handle so tightly his knuckles went white. Behind him, he heard Kellerman rise from his chair with the measured grace of a predator who had finally revealed his true nature. I'm sorry, Harrison said, his voice barely audible. What did you say? Your daughter. Sarah Kellerman's footsteps were soft on the conference room carpet, moving closer. Car accident. About 20 minutes ago. Brake failure on Mulholland Drive. Very similar to Diana's unfortunate incident, now that I think about it. Harrison turned around slowly, and Kellerman saw something in the old man's eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was the look of a man watching his entire universe collapse in real time and deciding what to build from the wreckage. You're lying, Harrison whispered. Kellerman reached for his phone, but Harrison was already moving. 45 years of suppressed rage, of swallowed dignity, of carefully controlled fury erupted in a single moment of perfect clarity. He crossed the conference room in 3 strides and grabbed Kellerman by the throat. Harrison! Hirsch scrambled for the panic button, but Harrison's voice stopped him cold. Touch that device and I'll break his neck. The thing that astonished Harrison was how easy it was. Kellerman was 75 years old, soft from decades of wielding power from behind desks and conference tables. His pale eyes bulged with surprise and something Harrison had never seen there before, genuine fear. "She's not dead," Kellerman gasped. "I was testing your resolve." Harrison's grip tightened. The truth, now. "She's at the Roosevelt Hotel, safe, meeting with our people." Kellerman's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "We needed to know how far you'd go." Harrison released him and stepped back. Kellerman collapsed into his chair, massaging his throat and staring at Harrison with something approaching respect. "Well," Kellerman wheezed, "that was unexpected." "Call them off," Harrison said. His voice was steady now, controlled. All of it. The surveillance, the threats, the entire operation. "You leave Sarah alone. You leave her documentary alone, and you let her tell whatever story she wants to tell." "In exchange for what?" Kellerman's voice was hoarse, but his eyes had regained their calculating gleam. "Your silence? We're back where we started, McKenna." "No." Harrison pulled out his phone and began typing a message. "We're somewhere completely different." Hirsch leaned forward. "What are you doing?" "Sending a text to every contact in my phone. Journalists, writers, Sarah's documentary team, my literary agent from 40 years ago who somehow stayed in the business." Harrison's fingers moved with surprising speed across the screen. "The message is simple. Conference room 3, Fox Studios. Come now, bring cameras." Kellerman shot to his feet. "You can't." "I already did." Harrison held up his phone, showing the sent message. "You see, while I was hiding in my bookshop for 45 years, the world changed. Information doesn't get buried anymore. It gets viral. And in about 15 minutes, this room is going to be very crowded with very inconvenient people asking very uncomfortable questions." The electronic device on the table was pulsing frantically now, its rhythm matching Kellerman's elevated heartbeat. Harrison could hear voices in the hallway outside. Security, probably, or damage control specialists, trying to figure out how a simple intimidation meeting had spiraled so completely out of control. "You think exposing us destroys the system?" Kellerman's voice carried a note of genuine desperation now. "We're a hydra, McKenna. Cut off one head, 2 more grow back. You'll destroy yourself and accomplish nothing." Harrison walked back to the conference table and picked up the unsigned contract. For a moment, he stared down at the document that represented his complete erasure from history. His name, his work, his very existence reduced to a legal fiction. Then he tore it in half. "Maybe," Harrison said, letting the pieces flutter to the polished table surface like snow. "But Diana Volkov deserves better than silence. Sarah deserves better than living in fear. And I deserve better than dying as a ghost." The voices in the hallway were getting louder now. Harrison could make out Sarah's voice among them, angry and afraid but very much alive. His daughter had found him, just as he'd always known she would. The story would be told, one way or another. Kellerman stood frozen beside his chair, a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." "Yes," Harrison said, walking toward the voices of the people who would finally hear the truth. "I do." The conference room door opened like a dam breaking, and suddenly the sterile corporate space was flooded with voices, camera flashes, and the chaotic energy of truth finally finding its way into the light. Harrison stepped back as Sarah burst through first, her face a mixture of relief and fury that reminded him painfully of himself at her age. She stopped short when she saw him, and for a moment the decades collapsed between them. She was 5 years old again, running to him after a nightmare, believing he could fix anything. "I'm here, sweetheart," Harrison said, and meant it in a way he hadn't been able to mean anything for 45 years. Behind Sarah came the journalists, the camera crews, the documentary team she'd been working with. They filled the room like water rushing into a previously sealed chamber, their questions overlapping, their equipment already recording the aftermath of an empire in free fall. Kellerman had retreated to the far corner of the room, his pale eyes calculating exit strategies, but Harrison could see the defeat in his posture, the way his shoulders had curved inward, the tremor in his hands as he realized that some secrets, once exposed to light, could never be buried again. "Is it true?" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. She was looking directly at Kellerman now, her documentary filmmaker's instincts taking over. About Diana Volkov? About the cover-up? Harrison watched his daughter work, watched her transform from frightened child to fearless truth-teller in the space of a heartbeat. She had inherited more than his stubborn streak. She had inherited his belief that some stories were worth the cost of telling them. "Sarah," Harrison said quietly, and she turned to him. "There's something I need to tell you about why I stayed away all these years." The cameras were rolling now, capturing everything. Harrison could feel the weight of 45 years of silence pressing against his chest, demanding release. He thought of Diana Volkov, 23 years old and bright with possibility, who had died for refusing to stay quiet about uncomfortable truths. "I thought I was protecting you by disappearing," Harrison continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was admitting. "I thought if I stayed away, if I became invisible, they couldn't use you against me. But I was wrong. They've been watching us both all along." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The surveillance, the threats, they've been—" "For decades," Harrison confirmed, "keeping me in a cage that felt like freedom, making sure I never got desperate enough to become dangerous." He looked around the room at all the faces, all the cameras, all the evidence that his careful isolation had finally crumbled. "But desperation has a way of finding you anyway." One of the journalists, a young woman who reminded Harrison painfully of Diana, stepped forward with a recorder. "Mr. McKenna, are you saying that Kellerman Industries has been monitoring you since 1977? That they orchestrated your exile from Hollywood?" Harrison glanced at Kellerman, who stood frozen in his corner like a statue of defeated power. The old producer's mouth was moving silently, probably calculating legal strategies, damage control scenarios, ways to minimize the catastrophe that was unfolding in real time. "I'm saying," Harrison replied carefully, "that some people in this town have been very interested in making sure certain stories never got told, and they've been remarkably successful at it for almost 50 years. Sarah moved closer to him, her camera operator following. "Dad, the documentary I've been making about Diana and the others, it's not just about the past, is it? This is still happening." Harrison felt something inside his chest loosen for the first time in decades. His daughter understood. She saw the whole picture now, the way the machinery of silence worked, the way power protected itself by making truth-tellers disappear. "The system evolves," Harrison said, speaking to Sarah but knowing his words were being recorded for posterity. "It gets more sophisticated, but it never really changes. There are always young women like Diana who know too much. There are always people like me who have to choose between speaking up and staying safe." The questions came faster now, a cascade of curiosity that felt like absolution. Harrison answered them as best he could, watching Sarah's documentary transform in real time from historical investigation to breaking news expose. As the chaos swirled around him, Harrison found himself thinking about his bookshop in Mendocino. The quiet shelves, the dusty manuscripts, the careful solitude he'd mistaken for peace. He realized now that he'd been practicing for this moment for 45 years, learning how to tell a story that mattered, how to find the right words for the hardest truths. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the journalists had their quotes, and Kellerman had been escorted away by studio security, Harrison and Sarah stood alone in the conference room where it had all begun. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. Harrison looked out the window at the Fox lot, at the dream factory that had chewed him up and spat him out decades ago. But he wasn't the same man who had walked away in 1977. That man had been broken by his principles. This man had been forged by them. "Now," Harrison said, putting his arm around his daughter for the first time in 20 years, "we finish the story.